For today's podcast, we're going to be talking about culture sharing and why it's a positive thing. But before that, we're going to ask people to contribute to my Patreon page and become Patreons. And that would be www.patreon.com/challengehistory. And the tiers are at $1, $10, $25, $50, and $100. And at the $50 and $100 levels, there's going to be a future giveaway for a Roman silver coin and a Byzantine gold coin at those levels. Those are actually from those empires at those times. And that's when we reach the proper level of those people donating those amounts. And that's just to kind of act as a little bit of a thank you for people donating those amounts with it to have a giveaway for those people. It'll start out obviously as a year, then we'll do it more frequently as we have more people at those amounts. And we'll do giveaways for the base level, the $10 and $25 levels when we get the proper number of people in there, and I'll figure out what I will do for those giveaways. I haven't really decided yet. I don't know if I've put anything on there yet with it, but I will figure out what to do with those. And now on to the idea of this. And we have from AVR experts, why culture sharing activities important for why are cultural activities important for young learners. And he was working with the neighbor around the block and instilling worldly curiosity, acceptance, aiming our futures sights high. And he basically our right here, Matthew Hastings sets the bar pretty high, sets the point pretty high right here, showing that there is a reason for establishing this idea, and it kind of defeats the purpose when people are trying to say the idea of cultural appropriation, because instead this is actually showing that it shows that young learners learning about new places is actually something that they can find interesting because it piques their curiosity. Now, this defeats the ideas of what they're trying to talk about, cultural appropriation, some of these more social justice ideas that have tried to shut down the idea of learning. And it can bring some of the ideas and allow people to learn more about what's out there in the world. And it allows people to start learning about different cultures and different ideas of what makes the cultures different, and can start breaking down. And if you look at it, it can also break down the barriers of racial division. And especially what we've seen is, since we've gotten some of the more technological advancements and been able to have more integration within communities, we've seen that the idea of racial hatred and bigotry has actually pretty much been eliminated throughout society, despite what we've seen the media and some of these different groups try to perpetrate as bringing up the ideas. Now, when we see societies that are actually without these advancements, they tend to be more apt to be prone to these bigoted and racially hatred ideas. And this is why you find that there are certain societies around the globe that, when they try to integrate into the cultures of the United States that may have been from remote areas, they tend to be more apt to be racially and they tend to be racially bigoted and show religious bigotry toward other people. And this doesn't, and it doesn't matter where they are in the world. And if they come from remote areas, in many cases they will show this attitude. And since we know that even in third world countries there are areas in which technology exists, we know that there is cases to where there is integration between cultures, but in each society, that we do have cases to where to where we have people who have been raised under remote conditions, and that will cause a attitude that's completely different. Now, what we're finding is that people within this nation are being taught, within the United States, are being taught that a horrible idea of cultural appropriation, which is completely trying to ruin this idea of the sharing of cultures, which breaks down racial, religious, and cultural barriers. And instead of the idea of sharing them, they want to essentially destroy them. And the fact is this is what actually makes people destroy the ideas of bigotry. And if you want to destroy the ideas of bigotry, you need to essentially allow people to learn about the different cultures. Now, we have people who've been essentially within this country who've been taught wrong. You have many of the people of black cultures that have been that assume that fried chicken actually comes from their culture. This actually is completely wrong. If they actually believe in cultural appropriation, they should assume that they're actually contributing to cultural appropriation. They were actually not the ones who actually created fried chicken. In fact, it was actually Filipinos who actually created fried chicken. The way fried chicken actually came to, and actually in the actual traditional recipes that actually we actually notice as fried chicken comes from Filipinos. The way fried chicken actually entered into the United States is actually very, very simple. It was actually through the Chinese that actually came in as railroad workers, and it worked its way across the country. And they had already been there even during the slave era, and this and since we had already had since they had already been there well before, we're talking this is something that they had been there in a very, very early time. And this was going on during much of the era during times of slavery as well. So what they did is they brought recipes that they had acquired through their imperialist times, and their imperialist times had them going through not just areas of Northeast Asia, but also areas of Southeast Asia, which included their influence over areas of the Philippine Islands and areas of Southeast Asia. And if you look at actually zoologically, where chicken actually comes from, chicken does not come from anywhere else in the world, naturally, except for areas of Southeast Asia, and that's where it's actually originally from. It's from areas of Southeast Asia like Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and even out to the islands such as the Philippine Islands. This is where chicken is originally from. What the chicken breeds that we actually know as chicken. So it actually came to the United States through the Chinese, and through different travelers that have actually dealt with the Chinese in different interaction through trade. And thus, we need to understand this. And without that, you would never have gotten chicken into the United States. And that's a major thing. We would have had other types of game birds, but not chicken as we know it. And for the actual process of frying, the only people in the Southeast Asia that was actually frying at the time, that was actually using any processes like that, was the actual Filipinos themselves, and using an actual breading as well. And they were using it with just a simple salt and pepper. Now the pepper actually was actually coming in from through the spice trade from Africa, which if you know that the Middle East is not that far, you know that that means Africa is not that far either, because when we're talking about the actual development of the spice trade. When we're talking about the relative distances between Southeast Asia, because next to Southeast Asia you have relatively close, you'll have Central Asia, then you'll have the Middle East, and then below the Middle East area you'll start getting into the core areas of Africa. And that's very, very important. So when we're talking about that, that's something that needs to be understood. And so when we talk about people on the idea of cultural appropriation, the idea should be rejected, because it only encourages the separation of cultures. And the separation of cultures only breeds more bigotry and more racism and more hatred. And this is something that if we want actually people to join together against these ideas, we should actually encourage the learning of new cultures. And we're only going to get this if we reject these outmoded ideas of cultural appropriation and things like this. And this idea of professional victimhood, and these ideas that are basically holding society back. Now, when I was in school with it, we would learn about new cultures specifically, and we knew that the reason was the new generation, every new generation would do this to basically learn about the culture, so that you would understand them and not become hateful toward them, and understand about them from where they're coming from, for their actual perspective for their lives. And this was very, very important. It didn't matter if we were talking about cultures in Africa, cultures in Asia, cultures in the Middle East, cultures in Africa, cultures throughout the Americas as like Native Americans, cultures in any of the Americas, being up in North America, Central America, South America, cultures in Caribbeans, Oceania, or wherever. And it didn't really matter, but what needs to be understood is that you do this to understand them. And some of the easiest ways to do it is understand them through their attire, and understand why they wear certain attires, understand why they dress and have makeup how they do, and then understanding through food. And this is some of the easiest ways that is easiest to learn, especially for kids. And then obviously understanding through the actual locations that they live. And sometimes understanding the actual physical temperatures, can actually understand physical temperatures and the actual geographic locations. And this can mean a lot to kids. And when they start learning at an early age about these things, they can kind of understand where everything's coming from, and why these cultures do what they do. And they are understanding from the actual religious context as well. And that's another very, very important thing, because these things are all part of the culture. And then they can understand that what makes some of the secular multicultural lands, such as the United States, very, very interesting is it brings in a lot of different cultures together and starts to cause a lot of mixes and fusions within those cultures within many, many cities. And you can get very, very unique mixes that are not seen anywhere else around the globe. Being what you call it, being through just multi-ethnic people to even fusions from different, could be music, could be food, could be designs in clothing and furniture, and it becomes an actual something that makes your country very, very unique. Now, other countries might be ethnically down to one ethnicity, which makes them going to be a little bit different, but it's still going to make them unique as well. And this is why we end up studying this, and it's very, very important. And people need to understand this, and if this is why this is very, very important to study. And I think that they need to focus on this and drop the ideas of this social justice. Eliminate the ideas of social justice. It doesn't provide anything good for the world. What they need to do is focus on things positive. Focusing on things on the negative do no good for the actual world, and they actually hold the world back. When we have this whole idea where we can talk to anybody in the world and actually learn different things from them, and learn what it's like to live in other different worlds, and yet we're focused on different things such as complaining about, oh, this person wore a dress from this culture, and this person did this, and this person did that. Well, we're worried about these superficial things, and we can actually learn about different cultures out there. It shows how backward our actual system is. We should not focus on anything on social justice. We should focus on the ideas of the benefits of culture sharing around the globe, because it's something that the internet essentially is something that it could expand, and we should love this expansion of it. We shouldn't hinder it. This is not something that should be ever hindered. This is something that should be basically praised. The cultural sharing is something that it helps younger learners basically not only learn about other cultures, but it breaks down the barriers of hatred, and it eliminates it. Now, if you eliminate that, that means the only people who would actually cause any hatred, the only type of views that would be of hatred, would basically be those of ones that would basically be people who actually hate your views, or based on disagreements of policy, and that's would be solely what would be left, and that is not hateful. That's only those are only disagreements in policy, and thus you cannot view that as anything of being hatred or bigoted. That is only solely based on disagreements on policy, and people are always going to have that, and that's just how debate works. This is why we should essentially embrace these ideas of what we have for the ideas of culture sharing. We should want more of it, not less of it. We shouldn't basically be saying, "Oh, this is bad," and we should want to shut it down. No, this is culture sharing is something that it should always be embraced. It's something that we can obviously do to actually make the world better. It's allowing people to understand each other, and it's something that can actually that breaks down the actual political barriers. Especially, it should not be a political ideology, and if your political ideology is based upon being against culture sharing, you should probably rethink your political ideology, because your political ideology is based upon bigotry and hatred. Because if you don't believe in culture sharing at all, it means your whole ideology is based on bigotry and hatred. It doesn't matter if you're one of these people that's against immigrants coming to your country because they don't share your ideas of because they come from different cultures, or if you're one of these people that talks about the ideas of if you're one of the people that talks about like ideas of cultural appropriation. Both of you people like that are completely and utterly bigoted. Now, obviously, when you come to a new country, you need to understand there's a certain code of conduct, which obviously anybody should understand. But if you're basically just hate people just because they come from another country, guess what? You're bigoted. If you hate someone because they like something from another country, and they like certain aspects of another country, and they're fans of it, guess what? And if you call that cultural appropriation, guess what? Those people who are on that whole cultural appropriation bandwagon, guess what? The whole cultural appropriation bandwagon, guess what? That's bigoted and racist. Because the whole idea is we should break down these barriers between people. If you don't want to break down those barriers, between people and their interaction between one another, which is the whole purpose of what the internet was meant to do in the first place, you're bigoted, you're racist against these people. And this is why we have these abilities to contact to each other. And we shouldn't be shutting it down. We should actually be embracing it. And we shouldn't be considering, and don't consider these ideas of human sexuality as a culture. It's not a culture. We should be embracing ideas of actually things of religion, of actually different ethnicities as cultures. Keep human sexuality on its own little level and keep it separate from these actual things. And if you want to learn about that, obviously that's a whole complete other topic, and that needs to be separate, and that's not an actual culture. What needs to be expressed on culture is something that actually makes people unique. It's what makes people from other different nations unique, and what would make it worthy in studying. Because if it were so with it, you'd have basically a land of transgender people. You'd have a land of cross-dressers. And I'm sorry, that's if you do not have countries just solely of cross-dressers, then or countries solely of transgender people, then you do not have an actual culture. That means that it is not an actual culture. It is more of an activity that that those people might share. That makes them within a same group. So they're within a same group, but it's not an actual culture. And this is why we actually define the actual culture of these people, of these nations, different than those others. Because that's with these others are within an actual group. They're more of a group within an actual community itself. And this is why we need to understand the actual difference. Now, when we're talking about this, we need to understand that we need to actually use this to break down the ideas of bigotry. And we don't want bigotry to continue. And if we want this to break this down, we need to end people talking about the ideas of cultural appropriation. I mean, that's probably biggest thing is because it's being used to shut down conversations, and we don't want people shutting down conversations. That's the whole point. And I think what needs to happen is, if we actually want serious conversations, that's where it needs to happen. And I think that's one of the major things that we need to talk about. And it's not just it wouldn't just be in distance learning, but actually in classrooms as well, because classrooms can actually, physical classrooms can actually teach the same things as well, because that's the way where I had started learning at a young age about this as well. And we can use it as distance learning as well with it, but it also works very, very well because you can have and especially in multi-ethnic classrooms themselves with it, they can kind of, first of all, start out with where their own backgrounds come from, start learning with that, and start expanding beyond that. They can say, okay, this is where my background comes from, but then start learning about well beyond that, and actually going well beyond that point, and learning maybe about other countries as well, maybe some other countries that interest them. And this can really and start learning about those other cultures, and they can really start interesting people, or interesting the kids, and especially if they and one of the easiest ways is actually through food, because food is one of the easiest ways to bring people together. Food and music are probably the two easiest ways to bring people together. So when you hear food and music, it doesn't necessarily have to be necessarily traditional music, though traditional music is usually a method that they usually use for teaching. But it can also be even modern music, so you can actually get a feel of what the average people actually listen to that are actually coming from their own countries, and you can actually get a feel for what actually exists there. And that's something that can make that special. Now, if you go with cultural appropriation and a lot of these social justice things, you're not learning anything. All you're doing is teaching people to shut down their brains and essentially engage in the ideas of trying to shut people up. And censorship is never a good idea, because it doesn't progress society. It just engages in the ideas of, we don't want to hear any new ideas. We don't want actual engagement between people. We just want to essentially shut people up because their ideas don't line up with ours, and we want the whole idea of discourse to shut down. Now, if you compare that with what we get with culture sharing does the exact opposite. It says we want more discourse. We want to essentially share as much as we possibly can and learn as much as we possibly can about everybody. And we get excited about learning about these other cultures, because it allows us to kind of share what we can about other different people. And there's different, you'll see different things from other cultures out there, from different snacks and different things. I mean, and this is some of the, especially because we have the internet nowadays, we can actually order different snack foods from other nations, and you can have the kids try that, and it's something that's completely new, and it breaks away from what all of the things they would be used to in their own normal lives. Now it's instead of going with the idea of, we need to go against this idea of culture sharing. Well, culture sharing is something great, and you need to understand with it. It makes people understand those other cultures. You want that understanding. That understanding is a great idea, and you could just use it by just simply just ordering different snacks from around the world. And as long as they're not on some type of embargo, because obviously the embargo was lifted on the what was it? Those what do you call it? Those eggs? Those chocolate eggs with the little toys inside. I forgot what they're called. But that was actually lifted by the Trump administration. But there's a lot of like your nation might have some type of embargo on certain items with it from certain countries. So there's that one point with it. But when it comes down to it, is there might be an embargo on certain items with it that obviously you have to be aware of. But beyond that is just what it called, just have fun with it, and that this is why these ideas of culture sharing can actually be really fun, not only important for the young learners, but also something fun that they can do. They can actually realize that it's not going to be a boring activity that they're going to have to go through. It's going to be something that they can actually enjoy. And if you go to the idea of this social justice is not going to be something that they're going to enjoy. It's just going to be something that's going to be indoctrination, and it's going to be garbage. You need to make sure that they're going to enjoy the actual learning. You don't want them to basically check out and basically become another person that hates school, and that basically checks out by the time they get through 6th grade, and they're not interested in any of it, and drops out by the time they're a sophomore at the earliest time that they possibly can, and they're not going to school anymore. Then they're basically most likely in a street gang and or doing something else, and that's it. Now you have an actual education problem. Now, if you go in this other way with it, you can actually inspire people to actually learn about something. When in the other way, you actually cause people to be completely disinterested in education because you were trying to push an agenda. Now, you're going to get completely different results when you actually do these two different things. Make sure that the results should be inspiring kids, not trying to push an agenda. And you want to inspire them to learn. You should be a guide, not an actual, not trying to push them into a certain agenda and make them as a freaking army of your political ideology. That should be the whole idea of education. You want to inspire them and to make them, to basically help them find their actual goals in life and allow them to achieve them. And you're there basically to help them as a guide, and that's the only role of the teacher. So this is why the idea of culture sharing is so beneficial to them, because it helps them, because it allows them to basically come up with an idea of what really inspires them. And at a young age with it, they're going to have something that's going to inspire them. What is something on the globe that actually represents where that would interest them? They could pick some random country and they can go, okay, I'm going to look up what makes this country interesting. And it could just be a random country, could be something that they heard about in the news, could be something that's they heard one of their relatives talking about. And that might just interest them, and it will fuel them to learn more about different cultures in the future. And this will make their interest in education go further. And that actually works for actually how we deal with people learning geography. Now we have people that don't even know about geography because they are more they're pushed with the idea of what we have for social justice. They know about all the social justice garbage terms, but they don't even know anything about world geography, and it's pathetic. And that's why we need to get back to what is important, which is using different tactics to, number one, eliminate these ideas of cultural bigotry, and use these also to teach them some important traits that are important educational tools such as world geography, such as learning about the other cultures, and this can actually help them as an actual real life skill. Social justice is not a real life skill. Social justice is garbage. And I hate to tell people this, but it is. It doesn't lead you anywhere. Degrees in social justice, degrees in women's studies, degrees in all this other garbage, they lead you nowhere. They're no better than a high school degree. I hate to tell you this, but that's the truth. You need something that's actually going to get you somewhere in life. And actually learning some of this stuff will actually get you somewhere, because you actually know something. You actually know something that'll actually get you somewhere, and it could actually get you in one area or another, and it's going to show that you have something that's actually of value to a company. And that's what you need to show in the actual future of things, and that's how things work. And this is why culture sharing is going to be beneficial, whereas social justice is going to be a detriment to kids in the future. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure you share it all the way around to your friends and everywhere publicly, and make sure you check out my Patreon page. And if you can't donate, make sure you share it with a friend who can. And that's it for this podcast. And make sure you check out my nightly live stream, and I will make sure to see if I can't get this up before my nightly live stream as well.